support pollinators. So I was expecting when I came to a DAR meeting that I'd be talking to non-gardeners. Do I have any real serious gardeners in the crowd?
Biologist.
I'm in garden club. That's
How
serious as I go.
Is that the Gettysburg Gardens?
Yes.
Good. That's a good group. So, thank you for inviting me here today. I'm trying to remember what Cindy told you about me. Not very much, but that's good. I'm a retired physical education teacher, health and physical education. And I've been a Master Gardner for, I think, about 12, maybe 13 years, somewhere in there. And I like to do this. I like to come out and meet people and talk about the thing I'm interested in. So I hope I can interest you. I'm supposed to talk about pollinators, and I thought maybe before I started I'd tell you a little story about why I am surprised to find myself at a DAR meeting. When we were, well, it wasn't just when we were kids, but when I was young, my grandmother was a very proud member of the DAR. We lived outside of Philadelphia, and my sister and I, we lived on a farm up in Perry County, and we were tomboys, and we liked to spend our days, you know, climbing trees, riding our horses, and that kind of stuff. And my grandmother thought it was a wonderful idea to take us with her to the DAR meetings in downtown Philadelphia, and this was in the 50s. And I have to say, we absolutely hated it. And we used to beg Mother, please don't let us go, don't make us go. But it turned out that my grandmother, we called her Gobby. Gobby was, I learned as I got older that when Gobby said it, everybody did it. And so we went to the DAR meetings. Not that there was anything wrong with it, but in those days, the ladies were dressed in their finery. They had their hats
And gloves.
and their fur coats and their white gloves, their diamonds, and they were totsy, and my grandmother right along with them. And she was a professional seamstress, and she actually made most of our clothes. I grew up when I was 18 years old, I used to dream of going into a store and buying a dress. It never happened because Gobby always made things, or my mother did, and they were beautiful clothing, I have to admit. So she would make us taffeta. We always wore taffeta. And this all comes down to why we did not like the DAR. We had to wear our taffeta dresses and dress up and act real nice. Nancy would sing and I would accompany her on the piano.
Well, things have changed.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I was counting on that to tell my story. So if you were all sitting here in your mink stoles, I would have just said how we used to like to go to the DAR. So there we are. Oh, great. I dug that out of an old scrapbook.
Oh,
And
my goodness.
there's mine away when I stand here. I stood over here hoping not to be in people's way.
Which one are you?
That's me in the red dress. It's my younger sister Nancy, who of course is taller than I am. She was even then. And our taffeta dresses, and my grandmother always had a taffeta dress. And
Heels.
Her heels.
oh yes, oh yes. So today I'm supposed to talk about pollinators, and I thought I would start to talk about, first of all, what is pollination? What exactly do the pollinators do? Why do we need them? Why are they in trouble? Who are they? I missed that one. And what we can do to help. So, I think I have 25 minutes left to tell you all that stuff, so get ready. First of all, pollination is the plant version of sex. And I was thinking, I bet you never thought in terms of your flowers out there having sex. But they do. Any living thing, of course, sex is a very big part of their lives because you need it in order to propagate the species, whatever it might be. So we need pollination to propagate whatever the plant is that we're growing. And there's a lot of information on that, and I tried to find a very simple, see how this works, diagram. There's the bee on the top there. Now the problem for the plants with their sex life is they can't move. They're stuck in one spot. They cannot move. They have no choice in anything. And so they rely on pollinators to accomplish the deed. And some flowers, as the one in the picture here, are called perfect flowers or complete flowers because they have the male and the female parts all in the same plant. And this is not information that you need to know when you get a bouquet of flowers and sniff it and say, doesn't it smell beautiful? But it is a little bit to understand the, how it's pollinated. Now, this part that looks like a jug, that's the female part of the plant. And the whole thing together is called the pistil. And it includes the ovary, and the stigma is kind of a long tube that comes up, the opening into the jug. And in order for a seed to be pollinated, the pollen has to get into the stigma. And the male parts over here, this got cut off, it should say stamen with an N on the end. And it includes the filament, which is just a tube that holds the anther, and the anther is the part that has the pollen. So they have to get the pollen from there up to the stigma. And I have no idea, I guess it's all in God's plan how this happened, but I was shocked to find out, for instance, a conifer, what we call a Christmas tree. It gets pine cones. That's how it propagates itself. Some of those pine cones are male, some are female, all in the same plant. Now, the pollen has to fall onto the stigma. So where do you think the male pine cones would be located on the tree? At the top. But they're not. They're at the bottom because it's the wind that comes in and carries the pollen up. They're one of the few plants that do not rely on insects for pollination. So some plants are wind pollinated, and usually these are the ones that cause us allergies. So many people are familiar with ragweed, and that's why I put that picture there of the ragweed. And the pollen on these plants are very lightweight, and it's very lightweight so that the air can carry it. And so they're what we call wind-pollinated plants. Mostly it's your grasses and your grains and your conifers that are wind-pollinated. So everything else has this heavy, sticky pollen that doesn't go anywhere in the air. And it has to be pollinated by the pollinator. This is a very interesting topic. I once did a lot of research on this and talking about the articles. I did an article one time about how different ploys that the plants use to attract pollinators. And don't think that those pretty flowers were created for us. Those pretty flowers are all part of nature's plan to continue the species. And they need to get the pollinator to the plant so that they can get a fertile seed, which is the only thing that can sprout into a new plant. So you have color. Well, here we have some purple coneflowers. Even though they look pink, they're called purple flowers. And butterflies, it turns out, are very attracted to the color purple. Not that they don't go to other flowers, but they are attracted to purple. Just like hummingbirds, almost everybody knows hummingbirds like red stuff. That's why your hummingbird feeders are all red plastic. But they do go to other plants. Once they're there, they find other things. The way the flower smells, usually it smells very, very good. There are some plants that smell horrible. They smell like rotting flesh is the way they're described. And the pollinators of those stinky plants are usually flies. Think about it. Where do you see the most flies? You see some animal roadkill that's on the road and it's been laying there for a few days and you've got flies crawling all on it. They love that stinky smell. The size and the shape of them, that brings you back to the hummingbirds where they have the long beak, and so they look for flowers that are tubular shaped so they can reach down in. A big fat bee like I had on the first page, that's not going to fit in that tube, so that bee isn't going to bother with that like a honeysuckle or something like that that's tubular. And of course the nectar is the sweet, sweet liquid that is found in all the flowers. I don't know if you did this. I mentioned we were kids on the farm, and one of our favorite things in the summer was to sit by the old honeysuckle bush and take the flower and bite off the bottom and suck out that little bit of sweet nectar. But all flowers have it. That's just a lot more easily found for us. So what exactly do the pollinators do? Well, anything that collects pollen from the anther, that's the male part, of the plant and deposit it on the stigma, the female part, is a pollinator. And it's because of the pollinator that the plant is able to produce a seed. It's because of the seed that the plant is able to reproduce. If it can't produce the seed, then you don't get another plant. So it all boils down to, if we have no pollinators, we have no plants. I probably pretty much just answered that question, but I was thinking of saying, which I didn't when I started, that you might be saying to yourself, well, this is on pollinators, I'm not a garden, I'm not interested. And my answer to that was going to be, are you interested in eating? Because thanks to pollinators, we have all the types of foods that we have. And it's really fascinating when you start to study some of this, that a particular plant will be pollinated by a particular insect. Some of them are what we call specialists. They only go to one plant. Well, if you wipe out that plant, then all those insects will die off, and vice versa. I just threw in that picture. That's one of my good friends who's in my garden club in Lake Mead. It's just a little spot off the side of her driveway. It's like nothing to her, but I thought it made a beautiful picture. And all those different flowers in there will attract, I'm sure it's humming today. So who are the pollinators? Mostly, of course, they're insects, starting with the honeybee up here. The honeybee is not a native insect. That means it didn't originate here in the United States. Our native bees people didn't used to pay any attention to our native bees. Even all of our, the winery and the orchards, all in Adams County, I think they still do, but they always relied on trucking in these trucks, hives of bees, right at the time when their trees were in flower, so the bees would pollinate them. They never gave any thought to the bees that live here. Most of our native bees are what we call solitary bees. You don't find a hive of native bees. You find them living individually in the ground or in a hollow stem of a native plant. So, but the honeybee I put up there because the honeybee and a lot of our other bees have these sacs, that's pollen. They have these special sacs in the backs of their legs that they can collect pollen. And a lot of the insects accidentally pollinate. They're after the nectar. They want to drink that sweet juice, and to get to it, they crawl past the anther and they collect the pollen, and then they spread it to the next flower. But the bee deliberately collects it because they feed it to their young back in the hive. And then there's our cute little ladybugs that everybody knows. Actually, all beetles are good pollinators. I don't know if you thought about bats, but bats are wonderful pollinators, and they're another one that's in a lot of trouble these days. Their numbers are declining rapidly. Down here I have a peony bud that's covered in ants. And there's a lot of misconceptions about that. People think, oh, the ants are going to kill my peonies. Or some people say the ants are needed so the peony bud can open and all that sort of thing. No, that's not true. The ants are on there because the peony is secreting its nectar on the outside of the bud, and the ants are just lapping it up, that's all. This is a picture I took one day, and I was taking the picture of the monarch butterfly, and the hummingbird just flew. He dive-bombed my picture. So there were a few of us that day, and everybody was so excited. Oh my gosh, you got them both in the same picture. Now, the little girl, she just basically represents people. If we go outside and we tromp through a field of flowers and we brush against things, we're probably actually pollinating some things, whether we know it or not. We're not very good at it. The same with dogs and the fox, and of course a bear or a deer. They get pollen on their fur and then they brush against the next flower, and that way they spread the pollen. But they're not nearly as proficient at it as the bees. The bees are by far the king of the pollinators. And then the same for the squirrel, just squirrels and people. And of course we can learn to pollinate by hand. Sometimes that's done in greenhouses. Sometimes it's done when people are trying to get this plant to cross with this plant, and they're trying to get what we call a hybrid. Their idea is to get, this one is a beautiful color and this one blooms longer. So let's create a beautiful flower that blooms longer. And after you try it about 300 times, once in a while, you get what you looked for. Otherwise, you get like a flower that's not very pretty, that doesn't bloom very long, and that sort of thing. So why are they in trouble? If you think back to what this country, or even Pennsylvania, looked like before the European settlers arrived, if you can, you can think back to the caveman days, whatever. Mostly Pennsylvania, what's it mean? Pens, woods. It was a wooded area. It had streams and rivers running through it. It had some open areas where it had wildflowers growing. It was a wonderful, wonderful habitat for all types of wildlife. But gradually, what happens? Man comes along, builds roads and highways, builds houses, cuts everything down, and just plants grass, which is just a no man's land for pollinators. brings in a huge amount of plants that don't belong here. So many of the plants that we have in our yard are plants that came from the other side of the world. It's not that they're a bad plant, but they don't support the pollinators. The pollinators over millions of years have learned to use a certain plant for the babies to eat so that their species can continue. And the imported plants don't do that. Of course, some of the imported plants turn out to be invasive. And an invasive plant is one who goes into the natural areas and just squeezes out everything, just takes over and kills the native stuff. And of course, I miss the indiscriminate use of pesticides. So many people who don't know about this stuff, they're like, oh, my beautiful rose bush, wait, there's a hole in the leaf, what shall I spray, what shall I spray? We get those questions in at the Master Gardening office all the time. Well, this is looking bad, what should I spray? Well, a lot of times, spraying is not the answer. Spraying is going to kill things that you don't want to kill, and maybe the thing that caused the damage isn't even there anymore, causing any damage. So the first thing you need to do is find out what the problem is, but this talk isn't about that. I gotta be done here in 30 minutes. So the pollinator numbers are dwindling rapidly. I need to take that picture. So what can you do to help? Well, that's the purpose of the handout that I passed out. You can plant a pollinator garden in your yard. One of the things that I suggested in that article is, like most people you see as I'm driving down the road, they have like a nice home. They have a little shrub bed out in the front, maybe a few boxwoods or other type of shrubs growing. Zip, that's it, and then grass. Grass is a wasteland for these pollinators. So you say, well, how could I add a pollinator garden? Well, you can go out in front of those shrubs and you can dig up an area. And then you can go down and buy yourself a few native plants. Why native plants? Because that's what the pollinators use in order to propagate themselves. The third thing I have there is plant a native rain garden. If you have an area that's always wet and sloppy and you're like, oh, I don't know what to do with this, it's always sloppy, look, it just rained and it's up to my ankles, that's where you put a rain garden. And you put in plants that like and stuff, and those plants will soak up a lot of water. Most plants, if you plant them in something where their roots stay wet, they will die almost immediately. They actually drown. Plants need oxygen and they need water. And when they have too much water, they can't get any oxygen, just like us. We get underwater and you try to breathe and you can't get oxygen, you're breathing water, you drown. Plants do the same thing, excuse me. But there are plants and nice shrubs that actually like that sort of thing. So I didn't want to go into talking about specific plants. I just made just a little list here of a few very common native plants that I would hope most of you know what they look like. Actually, that's a phlox in the picture that the butterfly is on. And that is called a tall garden phlox. I think that's actually the, Cindy had the article that she cut out, she was talking about. Garden phlox is just very, very easy to grow. It doesn't require a lot of extra anything. You don't have to fertilize it, you don't really have to water it. It'll bloom beautifully through most of the summer, and it attracts all sorts of bees and butterflies. And I don't know about you, but I love to go out and see what's out there fluttering around my pollinator garden. Bee balm is another. Penstemon is blooming right now. These are all like rather large plants. Violets, well, you all know what a violet looks like. Most people spend a lot of money to kill violets that grow in their yard. Violets are a very valuable native plant, actually, and they are a host plant for fritillary butterflies, which is a large, attractive butterfly. And if there's no violets, you don't have the fritillaries. Milkweed, you probably have all heard of as a plant that feeds the monarch butterfly. A milkweed is actually a poisonous plant. It's the sap that's poisonous. If you take milkweed and break it, this white liquid is going to come out. That's how it got its name, milkweed. It's actually, the proper name is Asclepias. And there's different types of Asclepias. You don't have to have the one that's called the common one, which some plants can spread themselves by something called a stolon. The plant will send out sort of a root type thing that grows along the ground, and then it'll stop and up will come another plant. And if you don't want that plant and you do nothing about it, that plant will mature and it'll send out about 3 stolons and up they'll come. And before you know it, your whole garden is nothing but milkweed. That's the common milkweed. But there's other milkweeds that are very pretty. The one now that they call the butterfly weed is blooming right now. I saw some on the way down here today. It's bright orange. It's a very pretty plant. And it does not do that. It can, all milkweeds will form seed pods. They're big, they're easy to see. And they'll hang on the plant for a pretty long time. And then eventually they'll bust open and it'll come out, think dandelion, it'll just, that white fluffy stuff will carry the seeds. Well, that's how it'll spread. If you plant some in your garden, but you're like, oh, I don't want this to spread. When you see it get the pods, just go out there with a pair of scissors and cut them off and throw them away. They don't have to spread. Asters are a very, very pretty flower. They look a lot like mums. There's New England asters, and there's New York asters, all native plants. Pollinators love them. I always say to people, if you're talking about which one are you going to plant, if you want to put the flower on your front porch right beside your door, buy the mum, because it doesn't really attract the pollinators. If you want to attract the pollinators, buy the aster and put it out in the garden, because I know my asters are up on the hill, and when they start to bloom, when I walk up the hill, I can hear them before I get there. Just so many buzzing on them. And these pollinators that I'm talking about, you can't guarantee that they will never bite you. But they are not the insects to be afraid of. That big bumblebee that I showed you at the beginning, I get a lot of them in my garden, and they're big and they're noisy, and I'm trying to work and that big bee is there and I'm just like, go on, get, and they fly off somewhere. Actually, the males of any bees can't sting you. It's only the females that can sting you, so you always have a 50-50 chance. I didn't
You
hear
can
you.
look at them and see which is which.
Oh yeah, just check it out.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Black-eyed Susans and coneflowers are the end of my list. If you thought, oh, maybe I'll go home and maybe I'll plant some native plants in front of my shrubs and see how pretty it can look, I wonder what I should plant. Well, I hope you wrote down a couple of those, because that's a good starting point. If you dig up a little garden and plant one of each of those, you'll have yourself quite a garden in a couple of years. Because all of them the clump will get bigger as it grows. Like you buy like a little coneflower in a 4-inch pot, and you put it in the ground. And it looks cute this year. Next year it looks a little bigger and there's a few more flowers. By the time 4 years goes by, you're gonna have a nice big clump of whatever it is that we're talking about. Oh, and the other thing you can do with those, which surprisingly some people don't realize, at the end of the season, these are all perennials. At the end of the season, they will all just look, you'll think, oh, they're dead. Well, they're not dead. The top part dies. That's what they're called a herbaceous plant. The top part dies off, but the bottom part will stay, and the roots will stay. And if you dig up those roots and cut them into a couple pieces, then you can have 2 plants or 4 plants. My phlox, I've divided them, I don't know how many times. Very easy, actually. So, the pollinators need the native plants to raise their young. I think I did mention that. Butterflies and moths need specific host plants. Like I mentioned that the violets are host to the fritillary butterfly. The asters are host to the pearl crescent butterfly. The Asclepias or the milkweed is host to the monarch butterfly. There's almost 200 species of butterflies that live in Pennsylvania. Actually, the monarch is one of the few butterflies that leave us. Mm-hmm. Now, they're the true migrator because they fly from us. Actually, they fly from Canada all the way to Mexico. And there's sanctuaries in Mexico. You can go online and you can see them. They're amazing. It's a certain special type of a fir tree forest. And millions of butterflies will fly to this small area and they're just hanging on the tree. From a distance, you're like, what's wrong with that tree? And then you get up close and you see they're all butterflies just hanging on there. And they hang on there all winter, and then in the spring, they fly north. And they get a certain amount, and they stop and they mate, they lay the eggs, they die. So the whole secret is they don't mate, they don't die. The ones that are new in the fall are the ones that can fly all the way to Mexico, live all winter, and then start the journey back. They get about as far as Texas or Florida, and then they die. But then the next generation comes along, and they work their way north to us. This is one reason we don't usually see monarchs until about this time of year. We might be seeing a couple monarchs in our yard if we have the right plants to attract them. Now the other thing there is the fact that the bees lay their eggs in hollow stems. Not all bees. There's hundreds of species of bees. Some live in the ground, but they don't build nests like your wasp nest and your hornet's nest. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the little bees that pollinate your flowers. And I just threw in that picture of my cup plant there. The cup plant is a plant that grows a little bit taller than me. It's got those pretty yellow flowers at the top. And in the wintertime or the fall, when it dies off, those stems are left and they're square. And those stems are about this big around here. That's my husband's caregiver. The stems are square which tells you when you find a square stem, you have a plant in the mint family. And mint plants are known to grow where they want to grow.
Yes,
So you have to be a little bit careful. But I've had this one now about 6 or 7 years. And this year I dug up about, I think there were 5 babies that came up. And I just gave them away last night at the Master Gardner meeting. People really want them because those hollow stems, that's where the bees go. They go down to the bottom and they lay their eggs. And that egg stays in there all winter, all this summer, next winter, and then it finally matures and comes out. So what they're telling us now is that you don't cut those stems the whole way to the ground. What I did last year with just my cup plant, really, I cut the stems off at about my waist level. And they just stood there all winter. They're very sturdy. And then this spring, the plant starts to grow. And it's growing right up and around them. You don't even see those dead stems. So that's kind of the latest in helping the pollinators. So if I got you all interested in gung-ho and you want to go start your pollinator garden, read my article, and if you need some help, call into the Master Gardner office. My supervisor is Marianne Ryan. She's a wonderful person, very, very nice. You would love her. And she knows everything. And we also have what we call a Master Gardner hotline, that if they're there that day and you call that number, you'll get the hotline. But it's a very good source of help. And if you just go in there and say, you know, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'd like to start a small pollinator garden, what would you suggest? They'll give you the details.